The first thing I felt was the sting. Sharp, jagged, and relentless. It bit into my right cheek, a rhythmic pulsing of pain that dragged me back to consciousness. I pushed against the ground, but my palms slid over loose, shifting stone. I tried to inhale, and the air hit my lungs like ice. It was thin, dry, and tasted of dust and scorched metal. I blinked, but the world remained a blur of gray and harsh. Blinding light. I shifted my weight, trying to find a solid anchor, but the earth beneath me felt unstable. My head throbbed with a dull, heavy pressure, as if my brain were trying to expand against the inside of my skull. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know how I got here. The last thing I remembered was the hum of a cabin engine, the smooth vibration of a seat beneath me, and the soft glow of a reading light. Now, there was only the biting cold of the ground and the relentless, abrasive texture of the gravel digging into my skin. I forced my eyes to focus, squinting against the glare, and pushed myself up to a sitting position. My hands were scraped raw, and my pulse hammered in my ears. A frantic, uneven rhythm that told me one thing. I was entirely, dangerously exposed. I stood up. My legs felt like lead, heavy and uncoordinated. I brushed the grit from my palms and looked out. The landscape was a testament to total abandonment. A massive, cracked airstrip cut through the earth like a jagged scar, stretching until it vanished into the shimmering heat haze of the horizon. Weeds, thick and yellowed, had long ago forced their way through the concrete, splitting the tarmac into a chaotic grid of gray islands. I walked 10 paces forward. The ground groaned under my weight, the sound echoing too clearly in a space that possessed no other noise. There was no wind, no birds, no distant hum of machinery, just the flat, oppressive stillness of a world that had forgotten how to breathe. I turned in a slow circle. Every direction offered the same vista, empty, dry earth meeting a pale, indifferent sky. I tried to spot a tower, a fence, or even a marker of any kind, but there was only the endless stretch of debris and cracked stone. The isolation hit me harder than the physical pain had. I was alone in a graveyard of concrete, a tiny speck in an expanse that seemed to have no end. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart, but the air remained stagnant and biting. This was not just a remote location. This was an entirely different reality. I kept walking, my boots crunching rhythmically against the fractured concrete. Ahead, the shimmering heat haze began to warp into a new, jagged shape. It was massive, a hulking silhouette that defied the flat horizon. As I drew closer, the structure resolved into a gargantuan cargo plane, its wings spanning the width of the runway like the ribcage of a fallen beast. This was an AN-225, or what remained of one. The fuselage was a map of neglect, the surface peeling away in long, curled strips like dead skin. Patches of deep, iron oxide rust bled from every seam, eating into the heavy metal frame. I reached out and pressed my palm against the side. The metal was cold, vibrating faintly in the windless air, as if the machine were holding its breath. Every rivet was crusted with grime, and the giant landing gear had sunk inches deep into the soft, weed-choked earth. It was a monument to lost grandeur, a titan of industry reduced to a skeletal shell. I walked the length of the wing, the sheer mass of the object casting a long, dark shadow over the cracked tarmac. It felt heavy with history, a dormant engine of war and commerce now surrendered to the weeds. I stopped at the nose, staring up at the cockpit windows, which were clouded with decades of grit. It looked broken, yet strangely formidable. A flicker of blue light caught my eye. I swiped the air, and a crystalline interface materialized, hovering just inches from the rusted fuselage. It was a stark, digital intrusion into this desolate reality. My fingers brushed the glowing projection, cycling through a series of cryptic prompts until a golden wheel appeared in the sky above the plane. It spun with a blinding, frantic speed, casting rhythmic pulses of light across the peeling metal skin of the giant. Then, the system shuddered. A sharp, red warning flashed across my vision. System error. Unknown talent detected. The ground beneath my boots bucked, a deep vibration rippling through the runway. A new window unfurled, revealing a holographic progression path. It began with the current, crippled shell of the machine and traced a line forward, spiraling upward toward a silhouette that shimmered with impossible, gravity-defying geometry. The visual data showed the transformation, from a rotting wreck to a flying fortress, and finally, into a celestial titan of the clouds. My breathing hitched. The fear that had anchored me to the ground evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp surge of power. This was not just a plane. It was a dormant weapon waiting for my command. I looked at the vast, empty sky and tightened my grip on the interface. The rust was only the beginning. The silence of the airstrip was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed against my ears, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of cooling metal from the giant plane. I stood there, watching the last traces of the holographic projection fade into the air. When the world seemed to shift, a sound tore through the stillness. Not a noise from the horizon, but a synthetic, jarring hum that vibrated directly inside my skull. It was cold, precise, and entirely devoid of human warmth. "Welcome to Airport Survival Game," the voice announced. The words hung in the air, amplified by an unseen source, echoing off the cracked concrete in the rusted fuselage. My pulse spiked instantly, slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. I spun around, scanning the desolate runway, but there was nobody. The weeds didn't stir. The wind didn't pick up. I was alone, yet the voice felt inches from my face. My breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as the reality of the situation solidified. This was not a hallucination. This was not an accident. The game had officially initiated, and the sheer scale of the silence that followed the announcement was even more terrifying than the voice itself. I clenched my fists, waiting for the next command, my senses strained to the breaking point. I closed my eyes and tried to summon the smell of cabin air, the hum of jet engines, the mundane comfort of a seatbelt clicking shut. It felt like a lifetime ago. I reached into my pockets, fingers scrambling for a phone, a wallet, any tether to the world I had lost. There was nothing, just empty fabric and the grit of the airstrip under my fingernails. The memory of that commercial flight, the safety briefing, the flickering overhead lights, seemed to dissolve, replaced by the relentless, sterile geometry of this wasteland. I looked at my hands, then at the vast, cracked runway stretching toward a horizon that didn't belong on any map. The contrast was physically nauseating. I had been a passenger in a world of order. Now, I was an asset in a world of code. I stood up, my knees shaking, and shouted into the void, demanding an exit. My voice was swallowed by the wind. No response. No panic from others. Just the absolute, calculated indifference of the system. The realization hit me with the weight of cold iron. The plane, the airstrip, the sky. None of it was a rescue destination. It was the start of a sequence. I was no longer a traveler. I was a player in a nightmare that didn't know the meaning of mercy. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on the empty air, waiting for the void to speak again. Then, it happened. A sudden, sharp flicker disrupted my peripheral vision, like a dying light bulb stuttering in the dark. I blinked, but the distortion remained, growing in intensity. A translucent, azure glow began to bleed into my field of view, coalescing into sharp, geometric lines. It was a projection, but it felt as solid as the steel beams of the cargo plane. Thin, glowing frames traced themselves into existence, hovering inches from my retinas. The air around the light seemed to hum with static electricity, prickling the skin of my arms. I reached out, my fingers passing through the light, yet the system responded to the movement as if I had touched a physical screen. Icons blossomed in the air, crisp and unforgiving in their clarity. It was a digital map of the impossible. The desolate reality of the airstrip seemed to dim, pushed into the background by the overwhelming dominance of the blue interface. Every instinct screamed that this was an intrusion, yet I could not look away. The nightmare had finally found its medium, and it was now mapped directly into my sight. I tried to blink the data away, but the blue light only sharpened. The interface solidified, text scrolling with a rhythmic, mechanical hum that vibrated in my teeth. Airport level 1. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Below the level indicator, a new box expanded, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic glow. Starter aircraft 1. The sheer scale of the designation felt like a crushing weight. I was not just a person lost in a wasteland. I was a unit in a ledger. I looked around, desperate for any sign that this was a glitch, a simple error of the mind. The system ignored my doubt. It projected a secondary window, listing resources and objectives that pushed the reality of the game into every corner of my sight. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm against the silent, static backdrop of the airstrip. There was no room for denial. The level was set. The aircraft was assigned. The challenge was no longer an abstract fear, but a series of rigid, digital constraints. I reached out, my hand trembling as I swiped through the submenus, watching the data points shift and lock into place. This was the foundation of my existence now. The game had initialized, and the numbers were already counting down. I turned my attention from the digital display to the physical reality of the beast before me. The cargo plane loomed, a massive mountain of rusted steel and oxidized aluminum. Up close, the decay was absolute. I walked toward the fuselage, my boots crunching on broken glass and grit. The metal was pitted with deep, jagged gashes, and the landing gear had sunk inches into the cracked concrete of the runway. I reached out to touch the heavy side door, but the paneling groaned and flaked away under the slightest pressure, revealing hollow, empty cavities where hydraulics should have been. I climbed into the cockpit, or what remained of it. The glass was shattered, and the control console was a graveyard of severed wires and dead switches. I gripped the primary throttle, pulling back to test its resistance, but the mechanism snapped instantly, leaving the lever dangling uselessly in my hand. The engine blocks were missing, and the wings hung at an unnatural angle, held up by nothing more than gravity and rot. Every inch of the machine screamed of neglect. It was a skeleton of steel, incapable of flight, incapable of movement. I stood in the center of that hollow cockpit and felt the crushing weight of the silence. I was not just stranded. I was anchored to a pile of scrap metal in the middle of nowhere. I remained in the pilot seat, staring at the dead instruments. A thought clawed its way to the surface, sharp and undeniable. I had no idea how to fly. Not a plane this size, not a plane of any kind. I had never even stepped into a simulator. The realization hit my chest like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. I looked at the array of gauges, dials, and switches before me. They were just a chaotic mess of plastic and glass, a language I could not read. I tried to remember the simple mechanics of takeoff, lift, thrust, drag, but my mind was a void. The silence of the cockpit amplified the thudding of my own heart. If this was a game, then every second I spent sitting here was a second wasted. Yet, my hands refused to move. I was trapped in a seat of command with no capacity to command. The sheer scale of the machine suddenly felt like a tomb. I was meant to pilot this rusted carcass, but I was nothing more than a passenger in a disaster. The pressure in my skull tightened, a throbbing reminder of my own helplessness. I was staring at a path to the sky while standing firmly in the mud. The impossibility of the task was not just a challenge, it was a wall. The silence in the cockpit was shattered by a sharp, melodic chime that vibrated through the metal frame. I flinched, my hands jerking away from the console. A blue text box bloomed in my field of vision, pulsing with a rhythmic, steady light. Basic aviation knowledge granted. Before the words could fully register, my mind ignited. A torrent of data flooded my thoughts. It was not a slow learning process. It was an instantaneous injection. I felt the surge of information. Aerodynamics, flight dynamics, engine protocols, and navigation charts, all locking into place like gears engaging in a machine. My head swam with the sudden weight of it. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my temples to steady the influx. Every dial and switch that had been a meaningless blur moments ago now held a name and a purpose. I reached out, my fingers tracing the throttle, and now I saw the mechanical logic behind it. The phantom sensation of lift and drag ghosted through my nerves. I exhaled, the sharp tension in my chest loosening as the void in my mind was replaced by cold. Technical precision. I opened my eyes, and the world looked different. The wreckage was no longer a tomb. It was a puzzle. I had the keys, and for the first time since waking, I had a direction. The rush of information settled into a cold, structured foundation. I looked at the interface again, no longer as a stranger, but as a user. The blue light cast a sterile glow over my hands. I swiped through the tabs, watching the data streams pulse with a rhythmic, artificial life. This was not a hallucination, and it was certainly not a dream. It was an MMO, built on a scale that dwarfed the reality I had left behind. Every action I took now, every decision I made, carried the weight of absolute consequences. There were no respawns here. The rust-eaten fuselage around me was not just a prop. It was my only lifeline. I stood up, the movement fluid and deliberate. The hesitation that had held me in the cockpit evaporated, replaced by a calculated focus. I was a player in a system where survival was the only objective. I looked out at the jagged horizon of the airstrip. The silence, once oppressive, now felt like a blank canvas waiting for my next move. I was no longer waiting for the nightmare to end. I was preparing to survive it. I gripped the edge of the console, my knuckles white, and mapped out the immediate threats. The game had set the rules, but I was the one who would decide how to play. The interface hummed, awaiting my next command. I looked at the vast, desolate landscape stretching toward the horizon, and a question gnawed at the back of my mind. If this was a game, there had to be boundaries, safe havens where the weak could breathe. I tapped the inquiry icon on the blue display. Are there PvP zones? The system responded instantly, the text appearing in bold white letters across the screen. All players are permanently flagged. The implication hit me harder than the initial crash. There were no sanctuary walls, no neutral ground, and no reprieve from the threat of other human beings. Every person scattered across this wasteland was a potential predator or a desperate scavenger, and all of them were hostile by default. My jaw tightened, my teeth grinding against each other as the reality of the environment solidified. I was not just fighting the elements or the mechanical decay of my aircraft. I was competing for resources against others who had the same system-granted advantages. The air around the airstrip felt colder, stripped of its emptiness. It was now a hunting ground. I looked at the interface again, my grip on the console intensifying, and realized that survival would not just require technical skill, but the constant vigilance of a soldier in a war zone. The horizon was a jagged line of rusted metal and broken concrete, yet it no longer felt abandoned. I turned, my boots crunching against the gravel with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. I scanned the perimeter of the airstrip, searching for patterns in the debris. There, near the shell of a collapsed hangar, a flicker of light caught the sun. It was too sharp, too precise to be natural decay. Someone else was out there, watching the same sky I was. My skin prickled as I realized the emptiness was a facade. I was not alone. The wind carried a faint, metallic scrape from the north, miles away, yet distinct enough to suggest a machine being salvaged. I dropped into a crouch behind the main landing gear of my plane. The world had shrunk. Every shadow now held the potential for an ambush. I kept my eyes fixed on the distant hangar, tracking the movement of that light. The paranoia settled in, a cold weight in my chest. If they were looking for resources, they were looking for me. I held my breath, listening to the rhythm of the wasteland, and realized that being seen was now the greatest threat I faced. I was a target in a game that had already begun. I turned my attention back to the blue interface, needing to understand the scale of this nightmare. I swiped a finger across the glowing icon, and the screen expanded, flooding my vision with a torrent of text. The regional chat was a digital riot. Thousands of messages scrolled by in a blur of neon blue, moving faster than I could read. It was a cacophony of terror. One user shouted about a fire consuming their starting zone. Another begged for coordinates, claiming to be trapped under the wreckage of a wing. The words were raw, panicked, and utterly incoherent. People were posting coordinates that didn't match the landscape, screaming about system errors, or crying out for someone to explain how to navigate the menus. There was no leadership, no organization, only a collective descent into hysteria. I watched the feed, my eyes darting across the stream of desperation. It was clear that most players were completely lost, stumbling through the initial stages with no concept of the game's mechanics. The frantic pace of the messages confirmed the sheer number of people trapped in this wasteland. I closed the chat interface, the silence of the airstrip returning with a sudden, heavy impact. I was looking at a global disaster unfolding in real time, and I was only one of thousands fighting for a way out. I could not pull my eyes away from the feed. The chaos was not just noise. It was the sound of 1,000 people reaching their breaking point. One message caught my eye, pulsing in the stream before vanishing into the scroll. I found a weapon, but I have no ammo. Something is scratching at the hull. Then, silence from that user. The chat moved on, indifferent. It was a digital graveyard. I realized then that the system was not just testing our survival skills. It was waiting for us to fold under the pressure of the unknown. Every plea for help that went unanswered left a hollow feeling in my gut. These were not just names on a screen. They were people being hunted in real time. Their resources failing, their hope eroding with every passing minute. I looked at the rusted, peeling fuselage of my own plane. It felt like a tomb. If they were failing, what chance did I have? I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I touched the cold, metallic surface of the wing. I was not just fighting the environment or the other players. I was fighting the sheer weight of a collapsing reality. The game was designed for us to burn out, and I could feel the heat closing in. The scrolling text of the regional chat began to fade, the blue light of the interface dimming as if the system itself was losing interest in the panic of the masses. I stood in the center of the airstrip, my hands balled into fists, trying to find a rhythm in the silence. Then, the air vibrated. A low, resonant hum built under my feet, shaking the loose gravel and causing the rusted plates of the plane to groan in response. The interface reignited, brighter than before, pushing aside the logs of the dying and the lost. A new notification bloomed in the center of my vision, solid and impossible to ignore. Open your starter gift pack and choose your talent selection. The words hung in the air like burning embers. I stared at the prompt, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest. This was not a suggestion. It was the next phase of the game. I took a step toward the interface, my boots crunching against the dry earth. The chaotic noise of the world outside had been silenced, replaced by the rhythmic ticking of the system clock. The gift pack flickered, waiting for my input. I reached out, my fingers hovering just inches from the glowing light, knowing that whatever I chose would define the boundary between survival and obsolescence. I looked at the glowing icon, the light reflecting off the dead, rust-eaten surface of the cargo plane. This was the threshold. I understood now that this selection was not merely a boost or a temporary edge. It was the foundation upon which every future action would be built. If I chose incorrectly, I would be another name lost in the regional chat, another ghost in the system. I pressed my palms against my thighs, feeling the rough grit of the airstrip through the fabric of my trousers. My breath hitched in my throat, shallow and sharp. The air grew still, as if the game itself was holding its breath, waiting for my commitment. I looked past the interface, out toward the vast, empty horizon. There was no going back to the life I had before the flight. There was only the gamble. I reached out again, my fingers steadying, bracing for the inevitable shift in reality. This was the moment that would define whether I remained a scavenger in the dirt or something more. I took a deep, steady breath, felt the cold air hit my lungs, and prepared to trigger the selection that would seal my path. I tapped the interface. The air in front of me didn't just shimmer, it tore open. From the center of the void, a colossal golden wheel materialized, anchored to nothing, spinning with a low, metallic roar that vibrated through the floor of the airstrip. It was massive, stretching from the cracked earth up into the pale sky. I stepped back, my heels digging into the loose gravel as the light from the wheel washed over the rusted fuselage of the cargo plane. Thousands of symbols, icons, and text streams flickered across its surface. Too fast for the human eye to track. Each segment represented a potential destiny, a path through this wilderness. The wheel accelerated. The metallic roar deepened into a hum that resonated in my teeth. It spun with dizzying, impossible speed, transforming from a distinct object into a singular, blinding ring of gold. I squinted against the glare, my hand raised to shield my eyes, watching as the thousands of possibilities blurred into a chaotic, spinning storm of potential. The environment around me began to react, the wind picking up, whipping dust and weeds against my legs as the wheel demanded my total attention. It was no longer just an interface prompt. It was a physical force, churning the air and carving its presence into the reality of the game. The golden wheel became a weapon of light. It spun so violently that the individual icons and symbols vanished, replaced by a pulsating, solid ring of brilliance that tore at the gloom of the airstrip. I staggered backward, my boots sliding on the loose, cracked pavement as the sheer intensity of the glow pushed against me. The air grew hot, smelling of ozone and ionized metal. Every time the wheel completed a rotation, the hum spiked, a high-pitched whine that drilled into my skull. My vision swam. I tried to focus on a single point on the rim, but there was nothing left to grasp. The world had shrunk to this spinning, blinding engine of fate. I raised my arms to cover my face, but the light bled through my fingers, casting long, frantic shadows against the rusted hull of the cargo plane behind me. The ground beneath my feet trembled, not from the wind, but from the mechanical force radiating off the wheel itself. Each revolution was faster than the last, a blurring frenzy that turned the sky into a strobe of gold. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, keeping time with the accelerating metallic shriek. There was no slowing down. There was only the blur, the heat, and the terrifying, relentless velocity of the spin. The terminal velocity of the wheel was a scream of pure energy. Then, it died. The rotation halted with such violent suddenness that the air seemed to snap back into place, leaving a vacuum of sound. The golden light shattered, replaced instantly by a jagged, crimson strobing light that flooded the entire airstrip. A red warning banner ripped across my vision, flickering with the intensity of a dying sun. System error. The ground beneath me did not just tremble, it bucked. A fissure snaked across the concrete, splitting the pavement in a jagged line toward the rusted cargo plane. I lost my footing, my knees slamming into the grit as the earth heaved upward. The interface in front of me glitched, the blue text warping and bleeding into static. My heart hammered against my ribs, each thud feeling like a physical blow as the system struggled to process the unexpected output. The smell of burning circuits flooded the stagnant air, sharp and acrid. I pressed my palms into the cooling gravel, waiting for the tremors to subside. Watching the red warning light pulse rhythmically against the peeling fuselage, the silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and entirely unnatural. The game was no longer running on its intended rails. The crimson light continued to pulse, but the frantic flickering slowed to a rhythmic, heavy throb. I pushed myself up from the cracked concrete, my palms raw from the gravel. The air felt thin, ionized, and strangely cold. The standard blue interface had dissolved into a sea of corrupted data. Lines of code scrolling past at impossible speeds before vanishing into black. Then, the silence broke. It was not the crisp, synthesized chime from before. The voice that echoed across the airstrip was deep, vibrating through the ground and into my marrow, sounding as if it were being dragged through grinding stone. System override successful, it rumbled, the words distorting the very air. Anomaly detected. User identifier confirmed. I stood frozen, my breath hitching in my chest as the message carved itself into the atmosphere. This was not a glitch in the programming. This was a fundamental rewrite of the rules. The voice returned, even lower, gravel-heavy and absolute. Congratulations, you have awakened a unique talent. The words hung in the air like iron, heavy and undeniable. I looked up at the flickering warning light, realizing that the game had lost control of its own logic. I was no longer playing by their book. The sky above the airstrip fractured. A massive, shimmering display erupted from the interface, casting a stark white glow over the debris. The words, "Aircraft Evolution," hovered in the air, shifting and rotating with geometric precision. I looked from the text to the hulking, corroded mass of the cargo plane sitting in the dirt. The projection superimposed a translucent, perfected version of the aircraft over the wreckage, highlighting structural reinforcements and advanced turbine arrays. I watched the progression path trace a line from the current, crippled state to a terrifying, gravity-defying titan. It was not just a repair, it was a total metamorphosis. My pulse, which had been frantic moments ago, slowed to a rhythmic, steady beat. The sheer scale of the power now linked to my command made the surrounding silence feel less like a prison and more like a forge. I stepped toward the fuselage, my fingers brushing against the cold, peeling metal. This was not the scrap heap of a forgotten war. It was the foundation of something that would dominate the clouds. I stared at the holographic blueprints, the gravity of the change taking hold. I was no longer a passenger in this system. I was the architect, and the game was about to be rewritten. I swiped the air, pulling up the regional chat. It was a digital riot. Thousands of lines scrolled past, a blur of panic and incoherent screaming. One player begged for water near a burning hangar. Another claimed they had found a single, useless tire and were ready to kill for it. They were hunting for scraps, fighting over the crumbs of a broken world. I watched the text cascade, the desperation palpable in every character. They were playing a survival game. I was playing a game of conquest. I closed the chat with a sharp flick of my wrist, silencing the chaos. The contrast was jarring. While they measured their lives in hours and scavenged for fuel, I held the blueprints to a machine that would eventually dwarf their entire map. I looked out over the desolate runway, the silence returning as the interface dimmed. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dry earth and stagnant oil. I walked toward the nose of the plane, my boots crunching on the shattered concrete. Every step felt heavier, purposeful. The game had tried to keep me in the dirt, but the talent had changed the baseline. I wasn't here to hide. I was here to build. I tapped the final icon in the progression tree. The holographic display expanded, swallowing the horizon. It bypassed the intermediate stages of repair, jumping straight to the endgame. The model transformed. The wings elongated, shimmering with a metallic iridescence that defied the dull, gray light of the airstrip. It was no longer a cargo plane. It was a monolith of engineering. I watched the projection cycle through its final form, the celestial Moriah. It pulsed with a contained, internal gravity, its engines shifting from combustion-based thrusters to something that hummed with the resonance of stars. The data stream scrolled rapidly, detailing orbital capabilities, atmospheric exit trajectories, and the ability to operate in the vacuum of space. My breath hitched. The screen displayed the ship ascending, leaving the atmosphere behind as a distant, fading blue curve. It was a Titan capable of defying the very laws of the game. I stood motionless as the projection cast a brilliant, ethereal light across the runway. The sheer scale of what I was holding in my hands was staggering. This was not merely survival. It was total domination of the skies above and the void beyond. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the raw, absolute clarity of the path ahead. The holographic light faded, leaving the real world looking jagged and small. I pulled the regional chat back into view. It was a chaotic stream of desperation. Found a rusted bolt. One player typed, "Does anyone have food?" Another pleaded. They were trapped in a loop of starvation and minor scavenging, fighting for the right to survive until tomorrow. I looked from the floating text to the massive, peeling skin of my own plane. The contrast hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were digging in the dirt for survival, while I held a map to the stars in my pocket. The chat was a digital graveyard of limited ambition. I swiped the interface away, watching the blue light dissolve into the dusty air. I walked to the side of the fuselage and pressed my palm against the cold, flaky metal. It felt like touching a dormant weapon. Their struggle was a distraction, a background noise in the story I was starting to write. I did not need their scraps. I did not need to hide in the weeds. My path was set, and the distance between my potential and their reality was already an ocean. I gripped the edge of the wing, feeling the grit of the airstrip beneath my boots. The game had assigned us all a role, but it had made a mistake with me. The terror that had defined my first hour evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I had been playing the game as a victim, waiting for the system to dictate my end. Now, I understood the board. I looked at the interface again, not as a set of instructions, but as a weapon. Other players were searching for fuel, for water, for a way to stay hidden. I was holding the only talent that could bypass their entire struggle. The realization settled into my bones like iron. I was not here to survive the game. I was here to redefine it. The rust on the plane no longer looked like decay. It looked like a mask, a hidden layer waiting to be shed. I scrolled through the system logs one last time, confirming the rarity of my status. No other player had access to an evolution path, let alone one that led to orbital flight. I was the apex predator in a field of scavengers. The fear of the unknown was gone, replaced by the weight of a singular, driving purpose. Every scrap of metal, every bit of data, and every second of this experience was mine to control. The game had dealt a hand, and for the first time, I realized I was holding every ace in the deck. I remained on the ground for a long moment, letting the grit of the airstrip press into my palms. It was the last time I would be this close to the dirt. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and metallic decay. I placed my hands flat against the cracked asphalt and pushed. My muscles burned with the sudden exertion. I felt the coarse texture of the runway beneath my skin, a jagged reminder of the vulnerability I was leaving behind. As I rose, I shook the dust from my hands, watching the gray particles drift away in the wind. The motion was rhythmic, intentional, and final. I straightened my back, grounding my heels firmly into the cracks of the tarmac. I was no longer the person who had arrived here in a panic. I was no longer a passenger waiting for a system to guide me. I stood tall, the shadow of the massive cargo plane looming over me like a silent titan. I brushed the remaining debris from my arms, ensuring not a trace of the ground remained on me. My heart rate leveled out. I looked down at the interface one last time, then closed my fist, dismissing the menu. The silence of the airport no longer felt oppressive. It felt like an empty stage. I was ready. I tilted my head back, letting the horizon line slide out of my immediate focus. Above, the sky was a vast, unbroken expanse of pale blue. It stretched outward in every direction, indifferent to the broken concrete and the rusted wreckage scattered across the airstrip. Before, this height had felt like a cage, a reminder of how trapped I was within the game's boundaries. Now, the perspective shifted. The emptiness was no longer a void of isolation, but a blank canvas. I traced the line of the clouds, imagining the path of a machine rising through them, tearing through the atmosphere until the air grew thin and cold. I watched a single bird circle high above, a mere speck against the immense depth of the dome. It was not a prisoner of the gravity below. It was a master of the height. I narrowed my eyes, measuring the distance, calculating the climb. The wind brushed against my face, pulling at my hair, but I did not blink. I stared into that endless blue until the burning in my eyes matched the fire of my resolve. This was not a prison anymore. It was a domain. It was a territory waiting for a signal, a space waiting for an architect, and I was the only one looking up with the intent to claim it. I looked down at my hands. They were empty now, but the interface remained tethered to my vision. I swiped the air, and the blue light flared back into existence, casting a steady glow across the rusted metal of the fuselage. I gripped the holographic projection, my fingers curling around the glowing lines of data as if I could physically bend the code to my will. The rust-eaten panels of the plane seemed to vibrate in response. I did not see a wreck anymore. I saw the raw potential of a dormant god. The chat logs continued to scroll in the corner of my vision, a frantic stream of people begging for survival. But I ignored them. They were playing a game of scraps. I was playing a game of ascension. I tightened my hold on the interface, feeling the system pulse against my palm. The wind picked up, whistling through the hollows of the wings. But I did not turn away. I would strip this machine down to its bones and rebuild it into something that made the clouds tremble. The countdown had ended. The trial was over. The game was truly beginning, and I was holding all the cards. I stepped toward the fuselage, ready to start the evolution. The sky was no longer a sanctuary. Above the cracked asphalt of the runway, the jet engine of REX-01 roared with a deafening, predatory hunger. He banked his fighter jet sharply, carving white scars across the blue expanse. He wasn't just flying, he was hunting. On my screen, the regional chat feed was a frantic blur of terror. Messages scrolled by in a desperate cascade from players who had watched him dismantle 3 nearby airports in mere minutes. They knew what was coming. I stood beside my massive In-225, feeling the vibration of his engine in my very bones. My eyes darted between the shadows circling overhead and the glowing system interface before me. The threat was closing in, and I was out of time. This was no longer a game of logistics. It was a struggle for the right to exist in this digital wasteland. Survival demanded a desperate roll of the dice. I hovered my hand over the evolution menu, the experimental weapon integration option pulsing like a heartbeat. It was a gamble that could just as easily end in a total system crash as it could in victory. I took a breath and tapped the selection. For a heartbeat, the entire world stood still. The wind died, the engine roar faded, and the interface flickered. Then, a violent shudder ripped through the earth. The rusted hull of my cargo plane began to groan. The sound of metal screaming against metal. I watched in awe as the massive plates shifted and folded like living tissue, shedding layers of decay. A deep crimson light pulsed from the core, a legendary mutation beginning its violent birth. The system flared with a single golden notification: legendary mutation, Flying Fortress. Beneath the massive fuselage, heavy mechanical arms unfolded with hydraulic precision, locking rotating cannons into position. REX-01 saw the change. He dove, his targeting system locking onto me with a sharp, digital chirp. 3 missiles detached from his wings, trailing pillars of fire as they streaked toward my position. I sprinted toward the cockpit, my boots pounding against the metal ramp just as it sealed shut. Inside, the world was a blur of blue holographic light and raw power. I didn't need to study the controls. The system flooded my nervous system with the craft's blueprints, making the plane an extension of my own body. My fingers danced across the interface as instinct took the helm. I slammed the throttle forward. The massive engines ignited, a wall of heat erupting behind me as the plane surged down the runway. The missiles impacted the earth exactly where I had stood seconds before, the resulting shockwave tossing my massive aircraft into the sky. I pulled back on the yoke, and the AN-225 climbed with an impossible, gravity-defying speed. High above the clouds, REX-01 banked hard to pursue, his voice crackling over the radio. I could hear the sudden, sharp confusion in his tone. "What the hell is that thing?" he stammered. I ignored him. My focus was locked on the targeting reticle hovering over his jet. The Skybreaker cannon began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth and resonated in my chest. The system prompt flashed in bright, cold text. Fire? I pressed the trigger. There was no explosion, no messy fire. A concentrated beam of blue energy tore through the atmosphere. Silent and absolute, it struck the fighter jet mid-turn. In a fraction of a second, there was only a clean, total disintegration. The sky cleared instantly, leaving no trace of the hunter. Then, the global announcement chime rang out, a cold, automated voice broadcast to every player on the server. Player REX-01 eliminated. Killer, Wakanda Airport. The chat logs went dead silent. No one moved, no one typed. I leaned back in the pilot's seat, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins as debris rained down in the distant horizon. System notifications began to pile up. Rare fighter core acquired. First hunter achievement unlocked. Top 10 threat status confirmed. I looked out the cockpit window at the endless, unclaimed territory of the clouds. The game wanted to struggle for survival, but I had just changed the rules forever. Far across the map, in a bunker hidden beneath a mountain, a girl stared at her screen in stunned silence. Her reflection ghosted over the words that had just cemented my name into the server's history. She dropped her headset, her hands trembling as she whispered to the empty, shadowed room. He is not just a pilot. The era of the hunter was over. The era of the fortress had begun. The burning wreckage of Rex-01's fighter jet spiraled toward the earth, a trail of black smoke scarring the sky. Silence hung over the regional chat for 3 seconds, then the server erupted. Is Wakanda Airport? How did a cargo plane one-shot a fighter? I watched the flood of messages and smiled as the system chime cut through the noise. Combat rewards distributed. A glowing interface materialized before me. I had gained a rare fighter aircraft core, 2,000 fuel units, and a class fragment. My unique talent, adaptive absorption, flickered to life, its interface pulsing with anticipation. Aircraft evolution compatibility detected. Begin fusion? I clicked yes. The core dissolved into raw blue electrical energy, snaking across my frame. The massive AN-225 shuddered as metal plates shifted and vents opened to vent excess heat. 3 evolution paths projected into my display. Mariah Assault, Mariah Interceptor, or Mariah Hybrid. I selected the hybrid. The transformation tore through the fuselage, binding the blue energy to my hull. A new passive unlocked, adaptive absorption, no limit on strength gains. The gargantuan plane stabilized, engines glowing with a lethal, cerulean light. I was no longer just a cargo transport. I was something else entirely. The triumph lasted only seconds. A crimson command console blinked to life on my HUD. A message from the Sky Dominion commander scrolled across the center of my view. Wakanda Airport possesses abnormal capabilities. Capture priority. High. Almost instantly, my radar pinged. 3 signatures, 2 agile fighters and a heavy helicopter, were burning fuel to close the distance. They were moving with professional, predatory intent. I checked my status. Armor integrity at maximum, engine output stable, weapons armed. I had 5 minutes before they reached my flight path. Just as I prepared to engage the interceptors, the sky itself seemed to fracture. A global warning tore through every communication channel on the server. World event. Bermuda Triangle dungeon open. First clear. Mythic class blueprint. The countdown timer began its relentless descent from 72 hours. The map expanded, highlighting the deadly, ancient region as a new focal point for every player on the planet. I stared at the blinking coordinates. The Sky Dominion wanted me dead, and the world was now racing toward a mythic power that would rewrite the game's balance. I gripped the throttle as the first enemy silhouettes pierced the clouds. It was no longer a simple duel. It was the beginning of a war that would pull everyone into the dark. The lead pilot's voice crackled over the open frequency. Surrender. Wakanda. You are worth a fortune. I reached for the throttle as lightning flashed, illuminating the darkening canopy. I was hoping for a quiet afternoon. Across the vast, fragmented server, a girl with an SSS-ranked talent known as the Queen of Aviation watched the global rankings in silence. She stared at my name, her eyes narrowing as she whispered, "I knew you would survive." Her focus was absolute, tracking the coordinates of the impending slaughter. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the dark heart of the Bermuda Triangle began to pulse. Something ancient, buried beneath the crushing pressure of the deep, opened its red eyes. A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the game world, shaking the very stability of the server. The air grew heavy, thick with the static of a coming storm. The enemy formation tightened around me, their radar locks pinging against my hull with relentless precision. The sky turned a bruised, violent shade of violet. The world trembled in anticipation of the carnage to come. The hunt had begun, and the boundary between the game and the abyss was starting to dissolve. I watched the silhouettes close in, the weight of the coming war settling into the cockpit. The enemy formation closed in, confident in their superior numbers. I cut the engine output instantly. The massive fuselage shuddered, stalling midair and dropping into a sudden, controlled free fall. Below me, the two fighters didn't expect a deceleration. They screamed past, their momentum carrying them into the empty air ahead. I didn't hesitate. I reignited the engines, the blue glow of the core blindingly bright. I activated temporary combat assimilation, sacrificing defense for raw, kinetic speed. The jet surged forward with an impossible, unnatural velocity. I closed the distance in a heartbeat, locking the Skybreaker cannon onto the lead fighter. A lance of pure blue energy tore through the sky, vaporizing the metal in a silent, violent flash. The second fighter banked, attempting to evade, but I was already on his tail. I fired at point-blank range, turning the craft into a fireball of spinning debris. The helicopter pilot panicked, banking hard toward the cloud layer, but I had already triggered the hidden compartments under my wings. 10 rockets locked on simultaneously. I fired. The night erupted into a series of jagged, searing explosions. The pursuit squad was gone. I leveled the wings, the silence of the high altitude returning as the radar icons vanished from my display. A mechanical chime echoed through the cockpit as the debris from the destroyed squad rained down. A global announcement tore across the interface. Player Wakanda Airport has eliminated 5 players. Title: Sky Reaper. Global rank number 87. My screen blinked with a sudden, private message from an unknown user. The text was cold, devoid of greeting. The Sky Dominion has marked you. You will die alone. Meet me at these coordinates. I pulled up the map. The coordinates pointed to a desolate sector, far from the safety of the starting zones. I stared at the blinking icon, then at the vast, darkened horizon where the storm clouds still churned with static. The game had changed. It was no longer a matter of simply staying airborne or farming for components. The Sky Dominion was a monolithic force, and I had just painted a target on my own fuselage that would never fade. I checked my fuel levels and adjusted the flight path, turning away from the wreckage. The war was coming. I pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engines hum with a new, dangerous potential. There was no going back to a quiet afternoon. The hunt had only just begun, and I was ready to see how far the system would let me push the limits. The sky above the southeast region did not just darken, it fractured like shattered glass. Jagged lines of black lightning tore through the atmosphere, pulsing with a rhythmic, unnatural energy. Every aircraft in the world groaned as engines stalled and systems seized. We were suspended in a moment of collective terror. Then, the sun was gone. The Void Dragon descended, a nightmare of impossible scale that blotted out the light. Its massive black wings spanned miles, dripping veins of purple fire that dissolved the very air it touched. Thousands of crimson eyes blinked in unison from its scales, all locked onto the trembling planet below. My cockpit screens flickered and died. The familiar, cold robotic voice of the system was gone, replaced by a sound that was raw and genuinely terrified. It screamed of foreign entities and rejected authority. A global notification burned into my vision in bleeding red. World Calamity Event activated. The system gave no mission objectives. There were no rewards to chase, no tactics to follow. It offered only a single, haunting command: survive. The dragon shifted its weight in the clouds. A single, casual wing beat triggered a pressure wave so immense it sent thousands of aircraft spiraling like broken toys into the dark ocean below. I fought the controls, diving the Mariah toward the jagged coastline. My hands white-knuckled and slick with sweat. Then, the dragon spoke in light. A beam of violet energy erupted from its throat, erasing a 10-mile stretch of the horizon in a blink. Clouds, mountains, and hundreds of players simply ceased to exist. My system log updated with a horrific, scrolling casualty count: 23,492 players erased in a single heartbeat. The world was being deleted, and we were nothing more than glitches in the way of a god. In the silence of my dying cockpit, my comms crackled to life. A voice, calm and impossibly familiar, cut through the static. "Hey!" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Sarah's face appeared on my primary screen. She was changed. Her silver hair flowed behind her like liquid moonlight, and blue glowing marks traced the lines of her neck. She looked like a warrior from another era, backed by a lethal swarm of autonomous drones that hummed with power. She smiled, though her eyes remained fixed on the sky, watching the beast. "Miss me?" she asked. I laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed my exhaustion. "You became rank 3? I managed to choke out. "And you became a wanted criminal." "Ryan," she retorted, a flicker of her old spark returning. But her expression hardened instantly. She tapped a hidden system window, revealing corrupted archives labeled Project Skybound. The data began to stream across my vision, revealing a truth that chilled me more than the dragon's fire. Sarah leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "This game was never a game, Ryan. It was a cage, a digital prison built with layers of code and consciousness." She pointed to the dragon looming over the world. "This system was designed to imprison something ancient, and the containment has failed. We aren't players, we are the wardens who forgot our jobs." Before I could process her words, a voice thundered inside my skull. It didn't come from the system or the speakers. It came from the beast itself. It was a sound of grinding stone and ancient malice. "Pathetic creatures," the dragon hissed, the vibration rattling my very bones. Its 1,000 eyes began to rotate in their sockets, scanning the horizon with predatory precision. They moved past the burning cities and the falling fleets, searching for something specific. Then, they stopped. Every single crimson eye locked onto my aircraft. The weight of its gaze felt like a physical blow, pinning me to my seat as the air in the cockpit grew cold. "Interesting," the dragon rumbled, the word vibrating through the hull of the Mariah. The sky above ignited once more, not with lightning, but with a sea of purple fire. My HUD went into a frenzy. The system warning turned a frantic, bleeding red, pulsing with a speed I had never seen before. "Warning. Hidden player detected." The text scrolled over Sarah's face, over the archives, over everything. "Player Ryan possesses forbidden evolution signature." The dragon began to descend, its massive form accelerating toward my position. The final notification flashed, bright enough to blind, calamity attention acquired. I looked at Sarah one last time, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and terror. I gripped the controls, the forbidden power within my own code beginning to burn. The game was over. The real war had just begun. Survive. That was the only command left. I pulled the throttle back and soared directly into the dragon's maw.